This is the annual discovery of the resurrection of the Lord. Not Jesus, not the Christian Lord, but Adonis, a pagan lord. It was a ritual that took many forms and was enacted each spring throughout the ancient world. Adonis was the divine ruler of regeneration. His very being was linked directly with nature's cycle of birth and death. Adonis' story was entwined with Astarte, the queen of heaven, who mourned his death and in her grief devoured his body and blood. In her womb, he would gestate and be born anew by an immaculate conception. God the Father would beget God the Son. His annual resurrection was evident all round. Life for everyone would continue. It was a festival that enthralled our ancestors. Such cycles of death and resurrection were common in ancient religions. What does that mean for the death and resurrection of Jesus? This is the traditional site of Jesus' resurrection, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The present shrine is a 19th century construction built upon the ruins of earlier shrines dating back to the 2nd century. This makes the evidence that it is the site of Jesus' burial very strong. But what is the evidence for Jesus' resurrection itself? The event which became the cornerstone of Christianity and confirmed the divinity of Jesus. In the Bible, it takes the form of two different types of story. Guiding us through this evidence is the professor of New Testament studies at Harvard University, Helmut Koestler.
The first type of story deals with the appearances of Jesus to the apostles and many others. We know that stories about these were in circulation very early because they are described in the earliest part of the New Testament, the letters of Paul, written around 50 AD. There's nothing very unusual about appearance stories in which divine beings appear in glory surrounded by blinding light to give commands. There are numerous examples in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and in the literature of other religions of the time.
The Old Testament cites several appearances of God to the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel. In Egyptian stories of the time, the goddess Isis was also reported to have appeared to mere mortals. In Greece, numerous witnesses, Greek and barbarian, testified to having seen the god Asclepius healing men and predicting the future. This is an alternative location in Jerusalem for the site of Jesus' tomb.
Now, if you'd just like to gather around here, we'll try to tell you just a little bit about this place.
It's less likely to be authentic than the Holy Sepulchre, but it does clearly illustrate the second type of resurrection story. These tell of Jesus' followers finding his tomb empty. Such stories are unique to Christianity.
On that side of the tomb. And what does the Bible say? John, describing his reaction, he said he saw and he believed. Now, what did he see? He saw the grave clothes there, but no body. And the lovely thing about this tomb is there's no body there. It's empty.
To most Christians, the empty tomb is proof that Jesus did physically rise from the dead.
Please come in.
But are the Gospels' blunt assertions that the tomb was empty reliable? The Gospels, after all, are not eyewitness accounts. They were written 40 to 70 years later. All four Gospels contain remarkable discrepancies. In Mark's Gospel, the earliest, the women see a young man in a white robe. In Luke's Gospel, they see two men in brilliant clothes. In Matthew's Gospel, they see one angel. And in John's Gospel, the latest, Mary Magdalene sees two angels. It is as if each successive Gospel writer has embellished the earlier story. Paul's letters were written 20 to 30 years before the Gospels, yet nowhere does he mention the empty tomb, a striking omission. Scholars now recognize many stories in the Gospels as late additions or inventions. Could the empty tomb story be among them?
Helmut Koester and a colleague at Harvard have developed a new theory which may explain how the story arose.
It was common practice among the Jews to worship at the tombs of prophets and martyrs. Even today in the Galilean hills, the tombs of ancient holy men, some of them contemporary with Jesus, are still maintained and venerated by the local Jews.
So we can safely assume that from an early date there was worship at the tomb of Jesus. But then, just before the Jewish revolt in AD 66, the Christians were forced to leave Jerusalem. So they no longer had access to Jesus' tomb. We also know that somewhat later the practice of worshipping at the tombs of martyrs had begun. So the Christians had to explain why there was no longer any worship at Jesus' tomb.
To avoid embarrassment, the Christians may have excused the lack of worship at Jesus' tomb by saying it no longer contained his mortal remains. And indeed, the tomb might well have become empty by this time.
This could have been for any number of reasons. The remains might have been stolen by the Jewish opponents. They might have been removed for fear they would produce political disturbances. Or indeed, the Christians may have taken them with them when they left Jerusalem. At any event, it seems likely that the Christians decided to explain the lack of worship at Jesus' tomb by saying the tomb was empty.
But as the Gospels were written down years later, the story quickly began to serve a different purpose. It began to be used to suggest the tomb had always been empty.